For everyone with an interest in NASH or more broadly fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 4, Episode 20 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our look at the question about how the role of patients, allied providers, and other stakeholders start to vary as topics change and we get closer to decisions starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
I shouldn't have to fight in my own house. And that's how I feel like a patient in the NASH community right now.
That is what my profession is about. It is to sit there and listen to both sides, but to be coming down on the side of the patient's well-being, their thoughts, their feelings, the way they want things to be portrayed.
Lots of ground to be covered to generate data, and we're on a good way, but we're not there yet. To broaden this and bring this out to the public and highlight the need of the patient.
Can we absorb enough different perspectives into a common discussion and give them each the weight they deserve?
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader, Professor Jörn Schattenberg, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and their guest, Global Liver Institute founder and CEO, Donna Cryer, as they explore common issues and lessons from the April 29th ICER and Midwest CPAC public comment session on obeticholic acid and resmetirom, and last week's initial sharing of results from the Delphi process on nomenclature on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
So for those of you who had the opportunity to listen to last week's episode, or for that matter, the earlier episode on ICER, but particularly last week's episode, we had three patient advocates, Mike Patel, Wayne Eskridge, Tony Biliati, talk about their disappointments with the ICER document on levels ranging from lack of empathy in the document to inaccurate use of numbers in terms of economics to old data in terms of epidemiology, and the fact that all those things were made available to ICER before the comment section, but none of them seemed to connect. We then go from there to the initial rollout of the nomenclature consensus work, which yields a solution that looks to me candidly like a compromise between a lot of academics, but it's not clear to me that it takes into account what other stakeholders need in the practicality of approving drugs, educating patients, moving the management of the disease forward. And it's kind of hard for me to figure out how you take 7 names and make them work. And then I go way back to 3 years ago, first time we had Donna on this podcast. One of the things we talked about was patients maybe being allowed to be part of the conversation, but not in a way that suggested they were having a lot of impact, and that being one of the things that we sought to change. Well, Jörn, Louise, and I are fortunate to be able to do this episode despite the fact that it's 1:30 in the morning where Louise is in Perth and Jörn is babysitting his kids at the same time. But more to the point, we're fortunate enough to have Donna Cryer, who could not make it last week, join us today. Hey, Donna, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Fresh from Chicago and Digestive Disease Week.
And Jörn, the kids are upstairs with the video, huh?
Well, don't tell that to anybody. It makes me look like a bad parent, right? No, I would have loved to be in Chicago, Donna, but schedules are too tight, and I'm very much looking forward to, some of your reports, the feeling. I know there was a dedicated NASH session. I followed some of it online, and well, let's see. I think, there's a lot of momentum in the field, and many more people are starting to comment and give ideas, which is good for the cause, but I think that's also one of the reasons why there's a lot of, you hear different opinions on certain things.
I'd say ferment. There's a bunch of ferment. And then Louise, 1:30 in the morning. Thank you. You're certainly a hero of the podcast for this one. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing very well, and I'm looking forward to feeling some of the feeling that was obviously at DDW and with the ICER report that Donna wasn't available for last week. So I think there's a genuine interest from all parties as to the stakeholder involvement and how that's playing out at this stage and through the next few months, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I spent the weekend dealing with a loss of a family member too young, and that was my Saturday and Sunday, so I really didn't get to catch anything that happened at DDW this weekend. I was on something, frankly, a lot more important and personal, but I understand it was quite a moment. So let's do icebreakers, and then I will pick up on my opening comment a little more, and then we will throw the floor open to the four of us. One good thing that happened in the last week for each of you. Brave one, go first.
Oh, my goodness. So before DDW, I was at Milken Institute Global Conference, which is just an amazing amalgam of health, technology, finance, with a very fun dash of celebrity. So I have friends of mine who are asking, I'm like, did you see Snoop? To which I will, at some point this afternoon, respond, indeed I did. And that was not even the most fun thing. So I'll just simply say that, in addition to all I did learn and the time I got to spend with learned colleagues ever meaningful to the field, like Dr. Francis Collins. But there are other fun stories to tell.
If you don't get to at least one fun story over the course of this next hour, we're going to be severely disappointed. But you don't have to do it this moment. If you want to do it this moment, go for it.
I mean, one of my favorites was getting to meet, and relevant to this podcast, was getting to meet Padma Lakshmi from Top Chef, who is just the sweetest person, so amazing, even more beautiful in person. But we had a really wonderful conversation about the prevalence of NASH in Southeast Asia. And she's very aware of the impact of diabetes in her family and the country. And so was really receptive to conversations about NASH. So hopefully we have won a new fan and potential spokesperson. I won't put that on her, but I will just say we had a lovely conversation, and she is just a beautiful individual inside and out, and it made my day.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Someone's going to have to figure out how to follow that. I don't know how.
Well, I can't follow that, but I am going to say I had an uneventful 17-hour flight from London to Perth, which is always a good thing when I get here, because I had to come home last time for a family illness that was not going in the right direction, but turned around. So that was my good news, and that illness is turning around in a very positive way at the moment. So I'm hoping to be here for the time, that 3 weeks that I'm supposed to be this time.
Two pieces of good news: uneventful flight, healthy family. Can't beat it. Okay, Jörn.
Yeah, well, happy to hear that your family's getting better, Louise. I mean, those things are really coming down to what it all matters about, right? And health. My last week was pretty busy. I traveled 3 or 4 days and spent 2 days in clinic. And we had feels like I said this before on this podcast, so we must have been doing it for some time. There was a 6th birthday party. And that was a lot of fun chasing kids. We did a treasure hunt and kind of went through the neighborhood looking for the goodies. So personal highlight.
That sounds fantastic. As I say, I think I'm gonna demur. My highlight is I'm delighted to be with you guys today. It was a profound, emotional, meaningful weekend. But when you start losing family members who are younger than you due to natural causes, that's tough. So I'm going to demur. But as I say, I'm with you guys today, and 3 of my favorite people, and microphone and headphones and all that. So that's a good thing. It's a good thing to fall back on every week. Now, let's go back to the conversation. I set this up a little bit. I'll go a little further, okay? When we first started this podcast, first time we had Donna on, we talked about the true meaning of patient empowerment. I then carried that thread forward to the following January. No, 2 Januaries hence, when Michael Charlton asked the question, who is going to be the Larry Kramer of NASH? I'm not sure Michael knew what he was asking at the time. I think Donna and I both have learned subsequently that different people might have interpreted that question in different ways that he meant it. But I think it's an important question, because what it alludes to is the idea that somebody has to be on the outside banging to get the patient voice heard. And how do you do that? We go from there a year forward to the roundtable at NASH Tech 2022, where one of the FDA folks, I don't remember which one, said if I had known now and understood patients now the way I understood them 2 years ago, some things might happen differently. I'm assuming that had to do with the OCA decision, although nobody said anything that specific. And now we come into a period when a lot of important decisions are being made. We have an ICER report on the value of resmetirom and OCA. We have nomenclature conference, and we have an upcoming OCA FDA AdCom, just to show that everything that goes around comes around. 3 circumstances where lots of stakeholders have points of view. Those points of view are not identical. And the question of who gets listened to and how loudly and what do we do about that becomes, I think, really important. And the conclusion from the first 2 is that while we say we're all about the patients, when we get to these moments, it's not clear that we act like we are. Donna, did I say that nicely enough?
You did. You said it so nicely that I don't dare open my mouth lest this completely go off the rails.
I'm going to let you expound, and if you derail us, that's fine, because I think at that point the fact that I'm not a patient leads me to stop.
It makes for great television.
And let me add, maybe this is a different perspective, different thought. And as an individual that is sick, you're affected by a condition, and you try to figure this out. So then there is a name put to that condition by most of the time your research on the internet or your physician. And to what extent does that name matter? Versus how do I feel and how am I affected? And maybe that, I know you have thought about this a lot too, Donna. That's kind of a...
I appreciate that too. So I Maybe I'll start this way. I was at an industry partners headquarters with about 40 of their lawyers, some from compliance, some from other areas of their legal team, at the behest of some of the R&D folks that I and some other patients had been working with for a while. And I said to them, I know how much you paid for my advice when I was at a PR firm. I know how much I was, billed out in that system. I know how much my advice was compensated when I was an independent consultant. And so we face a situation where it seems to me, based on what has been proposed, that you think that my advice is now worth only a fraction of what it was before, since now I am coming in through the door as a patient advocate. So basically you're saying that when you add all of my professional and academic credentials, you subtract for my lived experience to come up with what you're deeming as my fair market value. And they sort of fell over themselves and said, no, that's not what that's what the maths. So we started a better conversation about the work they do on differentiating between the consulting and advisory and the inputs that they get from the chief of gastroenterology at an institution to, a medical student or someone else that they would, and how they have found a way to differentiate the value of that input. And so I say that to mean, I use that story to mean that there's a discount that is placed on patient input. It's often glossed over. It may seem on its surface as if we're given a role, a seat at the table. But time and time again, that is just window dressing intentionally at its worst. At its most innocent, it's simply an inexperience of working with people with lived conditions and a lack of respect from that unfamiliarity and a marginalization that occurs. So ICER was not built for patients. It was not built for people. It was built for payers. We saw this particular review, and although their processes have changed a bit over the years because of the work of many patient advocates, including myself, but I give credit to so many more, and organizations like PIPSI and the Patient Partners to Improve Patient Care under former Congressman Tony Coelho, who helped write the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Institute for Value Innovation, of which I was on the founding board. So there have been many, many patient groups and many patients who've worked hard to get ICER to move the 1 inch so that there's just more window dressing. When it came to our review, it's an intentional misrepresentation of the disease, a mischaracterization of disease progression, of the role of fibrosis, of the role of placebo groups, of the realities of clinical practice. And it was, a forced timing, because otherwise you would wait for the data, and you can't both say, we don't have useful data, meaningful data to put into, so we have to make all these crazy, wild assumptions, and then say, we can't give it a good grade because we don't have good data. That's just nonsense. So the whole ICER review was nonsense, and it was important to get the patient points and voice on the record, but the ICER review was nonsense, and I really won't give it any more time. The nomenclature process has the possibilities of giving far more harm. And I think as I was trying to think about how I would be helpful to the next step of the process, that's the phrase that occurred to me as perhaps persuasive to the well-intentioned members of the steering committee, that all of the doctors involved took a pledge to do no harm. They're going to violate that oath. And so what I'm asking for, and what I've consistently asked for, and maybe I lacked clarity, although that's not something I'm usually accused of, I've asked for, many our advocates have asked for, and I was promised an impact report before a name change was rolled out, not while it was being rolled out, before. And an impact report would have people who have different skills than the academic medical doctors who have been steering the process. Those skills would be public relations, brand managers and change experts. They would be MBAs, Masters of Business Administration, just in case people are still confused, people who use numbers so that there is an independence and a rigor and a quantification of the various things that will be involved and implicated in this change. How much damage will be done, what costs would be incurred in the process of those changes, and how we can mitigate any of those harms. That has not been done. Any proposition that it can be done in a grouping or a convening such as the Liver Forum, which again lacks that different expertise that has been brought to the table, is non-responsive to the patient community request. I'll say that. FDA, God bless FDA. It would have been fantastic if we had had the opportunity that we do intend to do at some time to do an FDA listening session across divisions so that they would understand. We would have an opportunity as a larger community, scientific and patient and other, to really educate them on what is necessary across the device side, the cardiovascular and renal, the endocrine, oncology, as rare disease, as well as our hepatology division, because we see unnecessary adverse actions across the agency. It has not been demonstrated to my satisfaction or the patient community's satisfaction that any place in FDA understands how to evaluate a liver drug product device properly. And so that is the context in which we've come. And we've told them this. Now, do we have the money of Alzheimer's? No. But it doesn't mean that we're wrong. And so the unifying factor is a lack of understanding that what they are doing across entities has real world impact on real people that they should care about, but don't. It is not risky enough for them to make an adverse action in the liver community. And it will never be risky enough for them to make an action in the liver community until our community is larger and stronger and louder and scaled. And so the question I said at NASH Tag still stands. Maybe this is a question I only pose to the person speaking next to me at the regulatory panel, but what have each of anybody listening to this podcast done to increase the visibility and viability of the patient advocacy community so we can have the impact that we need on all of these entities?
That's a lot of ground covered, Roger.
I might have thought about this. Thank you for getting me out. I'm sure I'll sleep more soundly tonight, having gotten that out. So
no, I knew it. I think it's a great overview and voicing of what you as somebody who is a patient who works with patient advocacy feels about these different processes that somehow coincide now temporarily, which is very interesting to me. I think from the ICER report, something that stuck with me is that you said you're being used to paint the window, right? So I think it's about the patients. ICER actually has, or its task, as far as I understand, is also to provide, fair access and future innovation. And I understand that you feel that was left behind.
Yes, I know that ICER's role in the ecosystem is to send up a scary enough signal before a price is actually set so that industry folks will be, too scared to set a high price. And there may be sort of a function in that or some type of value in that in getting to a lower, more affordable price. But I don't think it's the right way to get to a useful end by having bad models, bad math, assumptions that were not just apples and oranges, but a whole fruit salad. It was a mess. They should be embarrassed. They demonstrated that they didn't know anything about the disease. They, by the time you got to just let's throw some hepatitis C era restrictions and see which ones stick to the wall, they should just be embarrassed by themselves, and they should have just closed their book and go sit in a corner somewhere. It was shabby and shabby, and they should be embarrassed. The fact that they're not just I mean, that speaks more about them, but they should be embarrassed.
So Donna, first of all, as a forecaster and somebody who has an MBA and industry experience and background in stats, I have some of the things that you're talking about, that evaluation lacking. And I have to tell you candidly, I looked at that one slide with the steatotic liver disease and 7 different branches and all that stuff. And commercially, that presented really unnecessary challenges to the marketing and education and distribution of the drugs and diagnostics when they came out. Okay. Right. Number one, there's an old line somewhere somebody said about some animal being another animal designed by committee.
A camel being an elephant designed by committee, I believe.
Yeah, there you go. Well, by that standard, this would be a llama, which would be an elephant designed by a committee that wanted something soft and fluffy at the end.
I understand. And here's the thing, to act like I don't understand. I mean, I'll tell this to somebody who doesn't know better is really, I should get that printed on a t-shirt. But I understand why we needed to do something because of shots across the bow, if you will, from your current home there in Australia. And those journals answered then in journals, and some physicians in some areas of the world starting preemptively without talking to everyone else, starting to use new terminology. And it was a noble aim by AASLD and EASL to want to come into this, provide a platform for unity. What was lacking was the proper application of their stature to just tell people to quit, that we need to focus on the job we have to do. And it is not helpful to our goal to have this convoluted name change and resources and time spent on this. They did not do that because, once again, those are not the skills they have. You would need to possess, though, the humility to realize that those are not the skills you have and to listen to others who have those skills. And that did not happen here. And so that's why I'm frankly pissed, because every entity in here involved has been told by people who have the requisite experience and knowledge what's the right thing to do if the goal is patient health. So I either have to surmise that is that others have a different goal, or they lack the self-awareness and humility to be able to listen and get out of the way.
So can I posit a third option?
Okay.
That's a little more benign than either of those two. Sociology looks a lot at in-group and out-group. This whole process was constructed for an in-group. And unfortunately, I mean, Jeff McIntyre, your guy, who I love and agree with on this, made the point that if 72% of the participants come from one stakeholder group and only 66% are needed to define a consensus, then if you get 90% of that stakeholder group on board, the rest of the world doesn't matter. So if the goal is to get to 66%, if 72% of the votes come from the in-group, and you have built a career on your ability to marshal and steward the in-group towards conclusions, then in fact what you will proceed to do is use the skills you have in pursuit of the goal you have the way you laid it out, which is great until you get to the rest of the world. So in that context, when you make a request to say, bring in all these out-groups with out-group experts that you guys don't know how to evaluate to provide what you're missing, you've completely changed the rules. And what that bespeaks, I think, is the fundamental conflict here, which is that everybody knows what they're going to get beat up for, and mostly people are trying not to get beat up. And as you point out, this isn't Alzheimer's, this isn't cancer. Patients don't have the kind of cudgel that they can use to beat people up effectively. Pardon the colorfulness of my verbs. Sometimes I can't help myself. And there we are. And by the way, just to understand, I'm about to turn to Louise, although it's now 2 a.m. in Australia and in Perth, and to say that when Louise talks about the way that allied health providers are treated in these processes, she's not much less emotional than you are. And Louise, I think you basically say the same things. Yeah.
I think every patient should bring a nurse with them, and we'll sneak you in the room and share our little seat with you. I think it'd only be fair.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think just listening to you there and that impassioned statement isn't, and Roger, you're right, it is exactly where I come from. I obviously have had a recent relative in hospital, and I was mortified in one respect. The comment was that so-and-so, you are really lucky to have this person advocate for you. A nurse is a patient advocate. We should not be reminded that it is a privilege for a patient to have a family member be that advocate. When we talk about these processes, there are not enough nurses on those panels because our job is different. I have been met throughout my career with some great physicians, and I have worked with some great physicians until you see the opposite side to their belief. And then you're just a nurse, because you are advocating for the patient's well-being, which differs sometimes from the research agenda or the agenda that is coming there. But that is my role. That is what my profession is about. It is to sit there and listen to both sides, but to be coming down on the side of the patient's well-being, their thoughts, their feelings, the way they want things to be portrayed. Because sometimes they don't have a voice in hospital. They don't have a relative. And that is a tragic place to be, but we have to keep our professional integrity. And which is why I do talk passionately about we are not seen enough on these panels. We are not in the process enough in the care pathways, yet we are going to be the educators. And I've been an advocate for having that discussion a few years back with Stephen about opening the nut. You've got to take a hammer to that nut. But then when we get to the end of getting to that nut, it is going to become messy. It's going to become fractioned. That shell goes everywhere. It's how we pick up those pieces and move forward, bring them back together again, and where do we move positively through? Because I think moving on from this, we will have a potential definition that we can't even educate people on currently, let alone another 7 different branches. But we are ultimately trying to find people's sick livers and then get to the right diagnosis to help that cause. But could it derail just even looking, which is my fear? Do we detract from making people aware of liver disease and fatty liver per se as the biggest global health problem and fracture it so much that we can't bring people together? And I certainly would find difficulty trying to educate. I've got GPs who still tell patients it's just fat in the liver, don't worry about it, it's not related to your cholesterol, it's not related to anything else, and just ignore it. So I think I do obviously align a lot with Donna, but that's because my profession aligns, and it is supposed to align to be that other voice in the room. But when we're not in the room, we can't do that.
I think it's really about power. It's great that it's coming up to Mother's Day for me to realize that my mother was right about several things. This is one of them. And this is about power. And who defines the field? Power is seldom given. You usually have to take it. It's interesting to me as I think back to the Larry Kramer invocation that they would want someone strong to tell other entities what they're not doing right, but they don't want that turned on them.
So, Donna, let me slow you. For A, that's a really uncomfortable place to have it turned on you. But B, I want to turn to Jörn because...
We love Jörn. It's about everybody but Jörn and Sven Frank.
Jörn, I'm hoping this isn't the conversation you wanted to make sure that we didn't quite have, because I'm not sure. But my question to you, as somebody who's worked to be phenomenally inclusive, right? Ken Kuzi says he wants to create a world of endohepatologists, and you're in the middle of becoming one. All right. You advocate for patients in a whole bunch of ways, but it's a complicated set of questions. How does one start to tap center a little bit so that the questions get asked in a different way?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one, right? So everybody has his hat on and, of course, his own experience and the way he looks at it. And I think something that I found very interesting is Donna reflecting on different positions coming into it as a patient versus highly paid consultant. It shows you the same person can be paid different rates. Calling it fair value is the interesting aspect here. Anyways, from an academic perspective, and thinking about the nomenclature again, the whole process was started from my perspective as an academic debate, and then it accelerated to a process that's huge, that's become huge, and really the people involved, kudos to them for all the work they invested. I think I agree with your comment, Donna, that it needs more than academic and scientific rationale at this point, where there was some guidance, maybe not enough, and we'll see how it plays out. I mean, it's up to the associations, I think, now. And I haven't seen all the feedbacks they've gotten, so let's summarize. This is not out yet. It's not final. It's an ongoing process, and maybe it has started something that will then be redefined down the road.
Jörn, I agree with you, and I would like to keep this off just the nomenclature and really talk about the broader idea.
Yeah, so on the broader idea, I think we're facing a situation where we have low awareness, slowly progressive, even scientific or let's say controlling bodies like ICER not fully bought into the recent data and the consequences for patients. So from the whole discussion and the situation, there's still quite a ways from my perspective perspective to be covered, lots of ground to be covered, to generate data, and we're on a good way, but we're not there yet, to broaden this and bring this out to the public and highlight the need of the patient and show that patients have impaired quality of life every day because their liver is swollen and inflamed or pre-cirrhotic, and that this is real. So that's one reason we spend time on this podcast, I think, because we want to really broaden the view and bring this out to the field more. I think that's my perspective here.
Just on one thing, Asia Pacific did go and leap into the sort of definition of MASH, MAFLD, but I haven't picked up a sense, and maybe it's just that I'm not mixing with that type or broad enough in the community here. I haven't ever felt a sense that people have been offended by changing it, or that it's created the controversy that the ongoing dialogue we're having now with the nomenclature has for Europe and the US. And I don't know whether that was because they did it right or they did it wrong.
They didn't really consult anybody. They just kept leaping into it. They didn't ask pediatrics, because pediatrics was like, hey, metabolic diseases to us is something else. Let's just trample off. So no, it was done wrong.
Yeah.
In fact, to me, the most interesting comment I've heard in this whole debate so far was at the AASLD session last November, when the panelists from India said, no, don't stop calling it non-alcoholic. Non-alcoholic is the best thing you can do, because in India, you hear cirrhosis, everybody thinks it's alcohol. When you call it non-alcoholic, people feel the stigma's been lifted.
Yeah.
And I think what happened is the reason I'm going to go with Don is they did it wrong. And I'm going to go back 2 steps deeper, and I might get it wrong, but if I do, please correct me. A, they didn't listen to multiple stakeholders. B, they're in a part of the world that lags badly on commercials. The commercialization issues weren't as important. And B, they're dealing with relatively disempowered patients. So if as Donna says, and I think she's right, it all goes back to power. That's a place where 94% of the power, I made that number up, but it's a big number, bigger than 90, is localized in one particular stakeholder group, and everybody else is accustomed to the idea that they are fundamentally powerless. When that happens, one stakeholder group can impose a set of rules, and it can ride. It might not be right, but it can ride. Here, as the dynamics get more complicated, more groups, more diffuse power, commercialization, being at the cutting edge commercialization, which is what the US and Europe are, changes everything, because the practical questions become very, very different. That kind of you need a different solution.
But that may be exactly why there isn't the groundswell of irritation here, is because people just accepted that was the name change. They weren't given an option, and that's not right. But they appear to have just gone, right, that's the new definition.
But if pediatrics said, no, that's wrong, then it's only right for a very insular group. I think Jörn made a really important point that I want to go back to. Everybody in this process is trying to do the right thing. ICER might be a slightly different story, might have a slightly different definition of the right thing, but certainly in nomenclature, I think everyone's trying to do the right thing, whatever they think the right thing is. It's just, I take Donna's point that when you're dealing with a multi-stakeholder world, you need to start with a diffuse multi-stakeholder solution that is truly, in fact, a diffuse multi-stakeholder solution. And that's been a bit of a problem here.
I would refine that, Roger, because I just want to make sure, because I felt throughout this nomenclature process, I've been gaslit a little bit, and my pictures used very liberally on presentations, and then my very strongly delivered opposition to just about everything sugar-coated over into some type of acquiescence, which it is not. I'm just too polite to bully babies in public, but it's more than that. It's more than that. And I'm trying to look up the proper quote from The Color Purple. It's basically, I shouldn't have to fight in my own house. And that's how I feel like a patient in the NASH community right now. I shouldn't have to fight in my own house. It's one thing to be able to, I have to fight to make sure policies respect us. I have to make sure that regulators, understand that we have a serious unmet need. I have to fight for airtime in media space and everything. But I shouldn't have to fight in my own house. And now I have to go and spend my time fighting in my own house with the doctors who are supposed to take care of me and lead my field. And they've been a mess that I, as a patient, now have to deal with the real world implications of implementing and cleaning up. And that's why patient advocates not only feel upset, but betrayed. Maybe it's just sort of, an eye-opening and a loss of innocence that every patient has to go through along their advocacy journey. But this, for me, even as a very experienced patient and denizen of Washington, D.C. to boot, is just, I feel, is beyond the pale and in the annals of disrespect of this one constituency, and to solve the problem that I'm trying to solve, which is to help patients get healthier. This has put us back, and I've explained that it would.
Roger, you want to say something, but I want to, just reflect that the patient has the disease, so it's a very self-centric view of one disease. disease. As the physician looking from the outside, in particular in NASH, we have multiple disciplines involved here, right? So I'm not even sure that we're settled the claim of who owns this disease or who should be the primary treater. We're talking about referral pathways, multiple disciplines involved. It's much more straightforward if you're an infectious disease and you have an antiviral and you treat with the antiviral. Here we're discussing which outcome in which disease stage is going to drive the outcome and what stage do we have to intersect. So coming from the physician's perspective, we need 2 or 3 physicians treating that NASH and associated risk factors. So that by itself makes it much more complex. And I think this is something we saw in the process where some people said, well, metabolic is a perfect term. And others said, well, no, don't call it metabolic because we're done with metabolic for a long time.
Right. And I appreciate that. And that's why in 2017, we created our NASH Council, which now consists of 80 different organizational members with calls to ACE, the Endocrine Society. I called the American Heart Association, invited in the Association of Black Cardiologists. We reach out, we have on our calls liver societies from India, the Vice President International Diabetes Federation. I knew that at the beginning and solved for that. So I appreciate that. And that's what I mean by you will need to tell it to somebody who doesn't know. I do this. Most of the folks that are involved in this process, as I have been painfully observing this, that's not what they do. I'm not trying to perform a transplant. You don't want me treating, I'm not trying to prescribe any drug. I'm not trying to diagnose anybody, but you come into my house, into my turf, and I've just brought all your muddy feet around stuff, doing things that you don't know how to do. And it's too much to do without a trip to the gym and a nap at this point, to come back in and to work with people who have all the power, but lack the knowledge and the humility to listen to those who do.
So it's interesting. First of all, I think what happens is people do what they know how to do. So the question is, are you defining what you need how to do properly? Okay. But second, Jörn, the comment I was going to make in setting you up to speak is that we're on audio, not on video, but I see this making you uncomfortable. And I get it. I think it's a complicated set of issues, and it's a little more complicated. I agree with you. And one of the things you've been great about, you personally and lots of others, is about reaching out to multiple medical specialties, because a lot of doctors have to own this. I think Donna's on a different point, and I'm not sure that one is right and the other is wrong. I'm sure that...
No, I'm on the same point. I applaud him for the work and just say, I was doing that beforehand. So it's the right thing, but you don't get credit for it, because if some of you had listened to me earlier, you would have already been doing it. We'd already get that place faster. Let me finish.
I was making a different point.
Okay.
It's probably too complicated for any one organization to take on their own, even yours, Donna. It's pretty complicated, right? You personally have this unique set of backgrounds that positions you at that moment to be able to see a lot more angles than anybody else can. But in the end, for a whole variety of reasons, this either needed to be a bigger tent, although when you get to a bigger tent, you're going to wind up getting with 14 different columns instead of 7, or a smaller tent that everybody trusted or was willing to push through. And none of that's happened, right? The tent is not broad enough in its perspective. It is not, as you said earlier, confident enough to just push through a solution. And therefore, the people who are in it do what they know how to do. And therefore, we get what they don't know how to do doesn't get done. And yes, they could have listened to you 5 years ago, but there was one you. My belief is if there had been 8 of you in 8 different places, it might have had a better chance of working. Just a hunch. Yeah.
So that's where my call to action is to do 2 things. Specifically around nomenclature, my request and my recommendation is to bring in different disciplines who understand how to do impact reports. And we move forward with doing that report before we keep rolling through with the introduction and socialization of a name change, period. On the larger issue of how can you have an advocacy community, if you want one, you may not want one. If you want an advocacy community that can meet the needs of the myriad challenges we have in the liver field that we have now enlarged to really be talking about a very broad concept of liver health that is much more inclusive, then everyone has a stake in helping to make sure they are referring patients for training our Advanced Advocacy Academy, that they are supporting in some form or fashion the scaling of GLI and other effective advocacy organizations. I don't claim to have the only one to get big enough and strong enough and solid enough that we can be effective on behalf of the community in the roles that we can fill.
So Jörn, as a guy of incredible breadth of vision and a real desire to do the right thing, and as a guy who's just nodding while Donna was saying all that, from where you sit,
wanting to do the right thing is not always the best result.
I have to tell you,
please
not wanting to do the right thing is automatically a disaster.
My husband is a research scientist, and when we first got married 18 years ago, he was appalled at how I shifted. He was appalled at some things I would come in from saying for this. After he had spent a few surgeries later, I'm sort of pulling him off the ledge. I'm like, well, you have to understand. understand. It'll be right. It takes time to do. And so this initial reaction to seeing just me, in more than second gear is something that I'm used to. It'll be okay. As we continue to work together and you see the world a little bit more from my point of view, you'll come over here too.
So, Donna, so my question is going to be sitting where we sit today, sitting where you sit today, talking about what we're talking about. What's realistic?
I think on so many ways we've come a long way. We have, across a number of societies, defined what we think is a severe patient with an unfavorable outcome in terms of liver disease, and we have therapies down the pipeline to treat those patients. Much more. The other day I had a call, and they were asking me, how far did we come? Can we implement this? How can we? I think we've now scientifically, maybe not the perfect tests, maybe not 100% on everything, but we're much more advanced as a field to define which patients we want to see as hepatologists. How do we want to treat them? This will be answered soon. And then how we want to follow them up. And I think that positive energy, bringing it to our colleagues, cardiologists, primary care physicians, endocrinologists, will let them realize that there is relevant liver disease in some of their patients, and they will refer these patients. So I think we're in a much more advanced. I do hear the risk of the discussions around, the ICER reports and nomenclature detouring us on these advancements, and that's a risk. I think that's also what Donna. I can't put words in your mouth, but I think we are afraid of losing some of the progress we've made, also some of the buy-in we've got from certain stakeholders, and I think that's a risk. But this field's been driven, the development has been driving the field, so I think we're in a much better shape than we used to when we started this.
So, Donna, yes, no, maybe so.
We have made progress. Many of the actions of the past several years has made the job of advocacy harder, not easier, but we will prevail.
Yeah, I think those two statements really sum it up. We're now trying to do things that are a lot harder than the things we were trying to do in the first place, right? I mean, it's when nobody is viewing the situation holistically, there are easy steps you can take, and then the more steps you take, the harder it gets.
Let me give you an example. I think 4 years ago, I was able to publish a monocentric study in patients I enrolled, right? So these days, if I submit to a journal, I need 5 centers from like 3 continents to be able to get the buy-in of the reviewers to do this. That shows me we have generated so much more data, and at the level the scientific momentum has increased, it's been just incredible in this field, I think. And hepatology has seen some of those examples. It's from the scientific academic perspective, really great to be working on this.
Donna, you sound more like Larry Kramer all the time. You know that, right?
Well, sometimes you get what you ask for.
You and I have had the experience of what happens when people realize what they ask for. So from where you sit, where does this go next? And then I'm going to ask Louise and Jörn and myself the same question.
So we are not deterred by whatever nonsense would happen in Chicago. We were focused on track just as, patients have been throughout this year, working very, very closely together in our sort of NASH regulatory and HTA boot camp as we march towards an FDA hearing. So we will continue to do that. We will continue to communicate so that the surround sound of it is, and then whatever the outcome is of, the May meeting, we will continue either way. I think this has been, if anything, just a crystallizing moment for the NASH patient advocates to come together even more closely with a common purpose, and the way that we have been working together and blending our very different talents and life experiences and approaches to this in one working unit has been in many ways the most fun that this lawyer has ever had. So we'll continue to do that.
Anytime I hear lawyer and fun in the same sentence, I worry that either something really good or something really bad is about to happen. I just haven't decided which one. Depends on the lawyer in the moment. And my this wasn't about nomenclature. My this was really about the broader issue, which is the more complex dynamic this gets, the harder it will be. I think I made this comment. I don't remember which one of the recent episodes and exactly what triggered it, Donna. But when these guys heard it, you didn't. When I was in marketing research, we talked about patient journey, but it was very mechanical. You go to this doctor, they misdiagnose. You go to this doctor. There was no emotion in it. And when you listen to patients and patient advocates, these stories are riven with emotion, right? I mean,
we need both.
Question becomes, how do we bring a more holistic sense of what it means to be a patient, or, Louise, a true patient advocate, nurse, to all the issues we're going to be dealing with as the issues get bigger and broader? How do we do a better job of getting that into the mix?
No, we don't need more patient stories. What makes me effective in what the types of things that we're doing now is not how many biopsies I've had or how many infusions I've had or my feelings about them or, how strong-willed I've been to overcome or the long, long nights I spent in intensive care crying. That's not what helps me now. What helps helps me now is my years as a former federal prosecutor and my ability to extract issues and solutions, to run teams. And what I'm asking the physician community in hepatology to do is to respect that part of me, to respect that contribution to the field at the level that it should be. And it has not been. And we are the worst for it. So what I need is more lawyers. I need more patient lawyers. I need more patients who can do the things that I do with the strength that I do them in all the different committees and rooms that I currently do them, and several more.
I hope they're listening to this and signing up, Donna.
Yeah.
And I think she's right. But also, we will come out of this stronger, because you have to have differences around a table to get through to the other side. If everybody agrees with one thought and one process, or wants to just flatter somebody by agreeing with that one thought and that one process, you will not come out of this process with the right solution. Will it be the right solution for absolutely everybody? Probably not. It is such a diverse topic with so many stakeholders. But what it will come out is strengthening, I hope, the community, because we will be able to air these thoughts and feelings in an environment where people, I hope, will listen and take that experience. The next best thing to the Donna Cryers and the lawyers in the rooms that advocate having been there are the doctors who have NASH. I scan them. Are the medical side who don't know that they've got the disease themselves because they don't look, or they've relied on a blood test. So we do have advocates within our own areas. We've seen them grossly affected by COVID. Healthcare was disproportionately affected. People who are likely to have had underlying liver conditions disproportionately affected. So we have our own advocates. We just need to find them within ourselves to be able to bring that thought, feeling and function from our own perspective. We're very good, and we've discussed it on the podcast, at being paternalistic in medicine. But we need to own it personally and see it from a different side. And this is one condition that affects so many people. It is going to be in our own community. But we don't see very many of our own come out and talk about it and how they felt and how they've been dealt with in the community. So I think there are lots of medical physicians who could be there. We need millions of Donna Cryers around the globe. And these patient advocacy groups and the learnings, they are coming. That's the empowerment that we will get out of processes like this.
Donna, I think Louise just said she needs you to be who you are, but less special, because there needs to be more of you.
Oh, she needs to be way special.
And I've been trying to do that for years. My team can tell you.
So I'm going to assume that those were Donna's and Louise's closing comments. Jörn, what would you like to add as we wrap this up?
It's been we covered many grounds, I think, in this topic, right? And I think Donna, on many levels, revisited some of the disappointments, because it's a disappointment from your perspective, what I hear, where we as physician, or maybe the associations, didn't spend enough time with the physicians. And that reminds me that this is about drug development and regulators and ICER reports and economies, but it also comes down to patients, of course, and they're in the middle of this, and we are talking about them. And, when I hear this from you, Donna, this is what brings me back to the point. It's about the patient. And you called me patient-centric, Roger, but we're talking to patients every day. That's all about them. What else can I say? I think these concerns you raise, they're well received.
That also makes my job harder, because most of you are so nice that I can't express really what I need to. So it takes me 3 times as long to try to say it nicely, but it's often less effective when I say it nicely instead of how I actually feel it. But I feel bad because you're so nice, Phil Newsom is so nice, Baru is so nice, and I do truly love you. And it's hard for me to understand how to cultivate you all and bring you along to where we need to be as a field in 2023 and beyond.
Let me share a couple of observations that are a little different in focus, okay? Number one, metaphorically, I'm not sure we know how to handle this. So we say, what do you want? I want a seat at the table. Easiest way to get a seat at the table is say yes to whoever the chair is. Okay, then I want a voice. Okay, but if you have a voice and your voice is heard, if you have a voice and people don't really hear it, then what's the good of that? Okay, I want to be heard. All right. If you're heard, how do you prove that? I want to vote. Well, if I have a vote and my side loses the vote, what does that mean? So what we don't really have around these kinds of power dynamics, going back to where Donna started when she said about power, is we don't really have a language of consensus, a true language of consensus. consensus. We don't have a language of the dynamic. So I'm going to go back to your original point, Don, a little differently, which is that managing the dynamic of an internal discussion, which is kind of what the nomenclature process has felt like, and it's really well managed as the dynamic of an internal discussion for the people in the room. But that's not what we need to do. The dynamic that we need to manage is a lot messier. And it needs to be, in the broadest sense, about inclusion, which is diversity inclusion, not popular concepts in certain places right now, but with a small d and a small I. That's really what this is about, which is, can we absorb enough different perspectives into a common discussion and give them each the weight they deserve?
I would also say to put people who are, and I don't know, and we understand this so well in other areas of medicine, but it comes into sort of medicine, medical legal areas, medical, political, or, whatever this is sort of society, these processes are. We forget the concept of putting somebody qualified in charge.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Putting somebody with the requisite skill sets in charge. Putting someone with experience for this type of job in charge of it.
No, I think we agree there are multiple aspects of being competent in this process, and that's what makes it so difficult, right?
Yeah, I mean, Donna, I would tell you the problem's more about the job specs than it is about do we want competent. It's we want competent at what?
Yeah, right. And that's what I'm saying. Maybe the administrative law judge should have been running like competent.
See, one the great thing about this conversation, we could add 2 more people to this conversation. We could go on for 9 hours. I don't think we'd resolve anything we haven't resolved yet, because that is the nature of this kind of a dynamic. And therefore, people just keep pushing. And hopefully over time we hear each other better. Donna, you don't like that?
No. I just, I'll just quote Popeye. I am what I am, and that's all that I am, as my final statement, rather than, because you're not ready. You all
do you
have
the
for the color purple quote. So I'll just
go ahead.
We'll go with Popeye. I do, and this is what I'm actually feeling, and this is what you all are not ready to hear. That all my life I had to fight. I'm going to amend the middle of it so it's all relevant. My life I had to fight, but I never thought I'd have to fight in my own house. She let out her breath. God, I love Harpo. She said, God knows I do, but I'll kill him dead before I let him beat me. And so that's where I'm going to go to the gym with that in my heart, and do some battle ropes and some boxing. And so that's what this is who you have as your advocate, for better or for worse. So we're going to move forward with all of these processes, and I'm going to get the job done for which I'm charged to do.
You will.
Yeah. Obviously, we gave you this hour, so we have some real sympathy with what you're talking about.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Louise, for being up in the middle of the night.
Yeah,
I hope you'll be able to go to sleep after I riled you up. And thank you, Jörn.
Yes, of course.
And we'll see now. Rambunctious teenagers are much easier to deal with.
For those who think we're done with Donna at peak moments, she'll be back with us when we review the FDA AdCom on May 19th, late in the afternoon, after all that closes out. I'm not sure who everyone else will be with us yet. I'm hoping you'll be able to stay up awake long enough to make it. Louise, I can't believe you'd have to
I'll be in Scotland, so I'll be closer to your, movement time.
You'll all be there. Okay.
But
I'll be here. All right. And with many more people joining us. Thanks, everybody. I'll be back with Business Report in a couple of minutes. Donna, thanks for taking the time, and thanks for, not surprisingly, being candid and open with your feelings and opinions. And Louise, thanks for being up all night. And Jörn, thank you for being part of this. And we will be back next week in a very different setting with Alexander Krag and Sven Franke talking about ICER Congress. Until then, take care, y'all. Bye-bye. Before we go into our usual weekly business report, I want to comment on the discussion you just heard. When I read newspapers, watch television, check out sites online, or do this work, I sometimes feel that the world has come to a place so complex, politically, economically, culturally, and in dozens of other ways, that we find ourselves challenged to find solutions that actually solve. Good people who want to do the right thing can find themselves profoundly at odds with one another, and not even understanding exactly how to listen or to process what they hear. And that's in a situation where everyone is well-intentioned, unlike, say, politics. The issues we discussed today, a disease that affects probably over 1 billion people worldwide, the challenges of educating people living with this disease who do not know they have it or even what it is, the costs of therapy, and the society's willingness to pay them. All these are emotionally powerful for key stakeholders and, above all other stakeholders, for patients. We might debate solutions, but no one can debate the validity or the depth of the emotions. This community is in for exciting times. Approved drugs, movement beyond biopsy, better educated and informed patients, but along the way, tremendous amounts of ferment, disagreement, and passion. Yes, passion for all of us are people who care deeply. I believe that whatever specifics anyone gets wrong, everyone is trying to do the right thing for patients and the disease. The challenge I hear, and perhaps the one you heard today, is for all of us to stay open and keep listening as the noise level rises, the issues become more complex, and the stakes feel higher. And with that, we'll go on to our business report.
And now for the Season 4, Episode 20 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. It's spring in Ukraine, which means the long-awaited counteroffensive is beginning or likely to do so soon. No one can predict what'll come, but let's hope this provides clarity and allows Ukraine to reclaim its country and begin to normalize life once again. Slava Ukraini.
Our ICER Congress coverage starts next week.
For our May 15th recording session, which we'll release on May 17th, Jörn, Louise, and I will be joined by ICER Vice Secretary Alexander Krag and Educational Counselor Sven Franke, who's appeared on this podcast before, to discuss what these ICER leaders see as the most important issues and exciting opportunities to emerge from next month's ICER Congress. The second preview episode, in which we will review what we see as the most important and exciting abstracts for the Congress, will record on June 12th, post on June 14th. Stephen Harrison is the first confirmed guest for this episode. We'll provide more information about that episode and the real-time and post-conference coverage in the coming weeks.
The rest of May has 4 exciting episodes.
As I just mentioned, we will post our first ICER preview episode next Wednesday, followed by our same-day coverage of the FDA Advisory Committee on Obeticholic Acid and F3 NASH, which we'll record late in the day on May 19th at the end of the FDA session and post on May 20th. Our May 24th posting will include Stephen Harrison and at least one of his co-authors discussing their recent major Nature Medicine paper on the state of art in clinical trial thinking. You can find a link to this article on our website in the coming week. And May 31st will be our follow-up reporting from the second Barcelona Conference on Innovations in NAFLD Care.
This week's Vault episode looks at important debates on non-invasive tests at last year's NAFLD Summit.
This week's Vault episode comes from last September, Season 3, Episode 46.5, our wrap-up session from the NAFLD Summit in Dublin with Hannes Hagström, Mazen Noureddin, and Sven Franke, who, as I mentioned earlier, will be with us again next week, discussing some of the debates and concepts surrounding NITs that arose at the NAFLD Summit 2022. Next month, we'll be at the first major European conference since Dublin, and NIT studies are likely to come to the fore once again.
Rest in peace, Nikki Bush.
I mentioned that I didn't have a lot to be happy about because we had a loss in our family recently. What I didn't mention is that my cousin Nicole Nikki Bush, who passed from a sudden aortic event a couple of weeks ago, was at one point in time the transcript editor for Surfing the NASH Tsunami back in September and October of 2020, when we had just changed our production structure and needed to find a way to get the episodes refixed. Nikki was the consummate editor, the consummate professional, and fierce about everything she did. Fierce in her beliefs, fierce in her passions, fierce in her love, fierce in her commitment to do the right thing every time. She's my younger cousin. She passed suddenly. And I want to thank her for helping the podcast and for being one of the moral lights that helped me shape my life. Gone way too soon. With that, I'm off for another week. Thanks to Donna for sharing so much today, and to my partners Jörn and Louise for helping move this conversation along, and to Jake, Magic Mike, Steve, and Eric for helping get this episode out the door. As I've mentioned already, we'll be back next week with our first ICER Congress preview. Until then, make sure to let us know how you feel about Rising Tide. Don't forget to send reviews, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.